Zaina woke up on the morning of her 39th birthday with a quiet hope in her heart. The sun shone gently through the curtains of their small flat in Kasimba, and she smiled to herself as she tied her wrapper and went to prepare breakfast. She had spent weeks sewing her birthday dress, a royal blue Ankara gown with soft gold patterns, just like the ones her late mother used to wear. She didn't have money for a party or a big gift, but in her heart, she was still excited. Maybe today Baraka would finally see her again. Not just as the tired woman who cooked and cleaned, but as his wife, his partner. A woman still full of dreams and love. She even painted her nails and put on the perfume he once said he liked. When their friends and family started arriving to celebrate, she lit the candles herself and smiled through it all, holding on to the hope that this birthday would be special. She wanted so badly for him to see her, to hold her hand, to say, "Happy birthday, my love." But what came next was something she never saw coming, and it would change her life forever. The room was filled with laughter, music, and the smell of jollof rice and fried chicken. Friends and family gathered in the small compound, clapping and singing, "Happy birthday to you." Zaina stood in the center, her heart full of emotion, her smile trembling as she looked around. This was the first birthday party she'd had in years. She had planned it mostly by herself, hoping it would bring her and Baraka closer again. She wore the blue Ankara dress she made with love, thinking maybe today, he would look at her and remember the woman he once adored. Baraka stood beside her silent. He didn't hold her hand, didn't smile, just watched. And then, as the song reached its end, he pulled out a white envelope from his pocket and handed it to her. "Open it," he said flatly. Confused, Zaina opened it with shaking hands. Her eyes scanned the papers inside, and her heart dropped. Divorce papers. At her birthday party. In front of everyone. The crowd was still clapping, some starting to cheer, unaware of what had just happened. Zaina couldn't breathe. "You're not what I want anymore," Baraka said, his voice sharp and emotionless. The music played on, but that night, after everyone had gone home and the noise of the party had faded, Zaina sat alone on the edge of their bed. The same bed they once shared with laughter, late-night talks, and dreams of growing old together. Now it felt cold like a stranger's room. She hadn't touched the food. She hadn't changed out of her birthday dress. The blue Ankara gown, once full of hope, now clung to her like a reminder of everything that went wrong. She held the divorce papers in her lap, her hands trembling as she stared at Baraka's signature. It felt unreal. Like a bad dream she couldn't wake up from. All day she had kept it together, smiling, nodding, pretending. But now in the quiet the pain came crashing down. Hot tears rolled down her cheeks, soaking into her wrapper. She didn't cry out loud. She didn't scream or break things. She just sat there, letting the silence wrap around her like a blanket made of thorns. She remembered every small effort she had made. Every meal cooked, every prayer whispered. Every time she forgave his coldness, hoping he would one day warm up again. And now this? A birthday gift wrapped in heartbreak? She looked around the room filled with memories and whispered to herself, "This pain won't be the end of me." Her voice was barely there, but it carried something deeper than sadness, something like strength, a quiet, hidden strength rising from the middle of her broken heart. She wiped her face, folded the papers slowly, and placed them on the nightstand. She wasn't ready to fight back yet, but something inside her had shifted. The storm had come, and yes, it shook her. But it didn't destroy her. Not completely. Not forever. Zaina didn't know how, and she didn't know when, but a part of her believed that one day she would rise from this. Maybe not as the same woman. Maybe stronger. Maybe even free. Baraka thought he had all the power. He thought handing Zaina those divorce papers would break her completely. But what he didn't know was that Zaina had already been preparing to leave, long before he ever made his move. Quietly. Gently. Without telling anyone, not even her closest friends. She had been building a plan in the shadows of her pain, holding on to a dream that had lived in her heart for years. After every silent dinner, after every cold stare, after every night she cried herself to sleep beside a man who no longer saw her, she stitched together her strength like patches on old fabric. What Baraka didn't realize was that Zaina had started saving small amounts of money from the clothes she sewed for neighbors. She hid the cash inside an empty powder tin under her wardrobe, adding to it week by week. She had a vision, one inspired by her late mother, a woman who used to make herbal creams and sew clothes for the women in their village. Her mother believed that every woman carried a story in her hands, and that fabric could hold healing. That idea had stayed with Zaina for years. So she had quietly started drawing designs for a women's healing studio. A place where women could come, not just to sew or make creams but to cry, to laugh, to breathe again. A safe place. She called it Nyaru Threads in her heart, named after the coastal town where her aunt lived, far from Kasimba, far from Baraka, far from everything that hurt. She had written the plan in an old notebook, kept under her pillow. Every time she felt broken, she would read it again. And every time Baraka ignored her, she whispered, "One day, I'll be gone before you even notice." So when he handed her those papers, thinking he was ending her life, he didn't know he was setting her free. He didn't realize he was giving her the push she needed to walk into the life she had already started building, brick by brick, in silence. Zaina didn't wait for another fight. She didn't wait for Baraka to beg or change his mind. She knew better now. So the next morning, while the house was still quiet and the birds outside were just beginning to sing, she packed her things slowly, carefully, with steady hands. No tears this time. No shouting. Just silence. She folded the few clothes she had, packed her sewing machine, her notebook full of dreams, and her mother's old scarf. That scarf had seen so much pain and yet always made her feel safe. She walked over to the dresser and took off her wedding ring. She held it for a moment, staring at the small gold band that once meant forever. Then she placed it gently next to the perfume he never noticed she wore. There was no note, no goodbye. Just that little ring. A quiet end to a loud heartbreak. Zaina didn't tell anyone where she was going. Not even her sister. She just carried her bag, her pain, and her plan. She boarded a bus heading to Nyaru, the small coastal town where her late mother's sister lived. The ride was long and dusty, but Zaina didn't mind. She watched the trees pass by, thinking about the life she was leaving behind, and the new one waiting ahead. There were no tears on her cheeks this time, just a calm she hadn't felt in years. She didn't know what exactly was waiting for her in Nyaru, but she knew what she was running from. A man who no longer saw her worth, a house that no longer felt like home, a life that was slowly breaking her spirit. When Zaina arrived in Nyaru, all she had was a small suitcase, her sewing machine, and a heart full of pain. Her aunt welcomed her with open arms, no questions asked. The house was small but peaceful, surrounded by palm trees and the sound of ocean waves in the distance. At the back of the compound stood an old wooden shed, dusty, forgotten, full of cobwebs and rusted tools. Most people would have ignored it, but Zaina saw something else. She saw a beginning. She spent days cleaning it out, sweeping every corner, scrubbing the wooden floor until her hands hurt. She hung colorful fabrics on the walls, brought in her sewing machine, placed her mother's scarf over a small table like an altar of strength. Slowly, that little shed became something beautiful. A healing space. A safe space. A new chapter. She started teaching young girls in the neighborhood how to sew. Most of them had never touched a needle before, but they came curious and shy. Zaina taught with patience and love, showing them not just how to stitch fabric, but how to stitch their own confidence. Each dress they made wasn't just clothing. It was proof that they could create something valuable with their own hands. Zaina also began mixing herbal creams using old recipes from her mother's journal. Neem, shea butter, morina, coconut oil, simple ingredients that smelled like home and felt like care. The women in the community came to her with skin problems, body aches, and heavy hearts. And Zaina gave them more than just creams. She gave them comfort, conversation, and a space to breathe. Every fabric she stitched, every balm she made, carried a piece of her story. Her pain didn't disappear, but it changed shape. It became something she could hold, something she could give, something that helped others heal too. In that small, bright shed in Nyaru, Zaina was no longer just a woman who had been broken. She was a woman rebuilding. Not just herself, but everyone who walked through her door. One stitch, one SM. As weeks passed in Nyaru, Zaina began to meet more women. Women who, like her, were carrying wounds no one could see. They didn't wear their pain on their faces, but it lived in their eyes, in their silence, in the way they looked down when asked about their past. Some were widows still sleeping on one side of the bed. Some were single mothers raising children on nothing but prayer and determination. Others were wives still living with husbands who treated them like furniture. There but invisible. They found each other slowly. at the market, at the water tap, in passing conversations that turned into deep stories. And before long, Zaina's little shed became more than a sewing space. It became a shelter for the soul. They began meeting in the evenings, after the children had been fed and the chores were done. They would gather under the big mango tree beside the shed, sitting on mats, drinking warm tea, and letting their hearts speak freely. Some nights were filled with laughter, loud, belly-shaking laughter that surprised them all. Other nights were quiet, soaked in tears and soft prayers whispered between friends. They talked about lost dreams, broken marriages, betrayal, and shame. But they also spoke about hope, about healing, about starting again. Zaina didn't lead them like a teacher. She sat with them like a sister. She shared her own story too. The birthday, the divorce, the silent pain. And in doing so, she gave them permission to open up, to stop pretending, to just be real. Together, they were building something sacred. A circle of women who reminded each other that they were still worthy, still beautiful, still strong. They stitched more than just fabric. They stitched each other's hearts. Under that mango tree, lit by moonlight and surrounded by the soft sound of ocean wind, they found something they hadn't felt in a long time: belonging. And for the first time in years, Zaina didn't feel alone. She had found her sisters, not by blood but by shared strew. One warm afternoon in Nyaru, surrounded by laughter, fabric scraps, and the soft hum of sewing machines, Zaina looked around and felt something stir deep inside her. The little group of women she had been working with were no longer just students or neighbors. They were creators, survivors, artists. And what they were making was more than just clothes. It was healing stitched into every seam. That's when the idea finally became real. With their support, Zaina officially launched Nyaru Threads, a small but powerful line of handcrafted fabrics, dresses, and head wraps made with love, tradition, and healing herbs. They used ingredients passed down through generations like hibiscus, neem, and morina, not just in their creams but in the fabrics themselves, adding natural dyes and calming scents. Each piece told a story. Each stitch carried strength. The women chose patterns inspired by their own journeys, waves to show movement, broken lines to show pain, bold colors to show courage. And slowly word began to spread, first among local markets. Then one day, a traveling lifestyle blogger visiting Nyaru came across Zaina's studio while looking for handmade souvenirs. She listened to Zaina's story, took pictures of the fabrics, and asked to share her journey online. Zaina agreed, never expecting much. But just a week later, everything changed. The blogger's post went viral. People from cities across the continent, and even abroad, were moved by the story of a woman who turned heartbreak into healing and fabric into hope. Orders started pouring in. Messages came from women saying, "Your story gave me strength." Some even asked how they could learn to sew or support the project. Zaina cried when she saw the first international order. Not because of the money, but because for the first time the world wasn't just seeing her pain, they were seeing her purpose. Nyaru Threads wasn't just a brand. It was a movement, a quiet revolution led by women who had been told they were too. Back in Kasimba, life didn't turn out the way Baraka imagined. After Zaina left, he quickly moved on and married a younger woman named Leia. She was beautiful, loud, and full of energy. At first, Baraka felt proud, walking through the streets with her on his arm, thinking he had upgraded. But it didn't take long for the truth to show itself. Leia wasn't like Zaina. She didn't wake up early to cook his favorite meals or pray for him before he left for work. She didn't care if his clothes were ironed or if he came home tired. All she wanted was money, gifts, and attention. If he came home late, she didn't ask if he was okay. She asked what he brought her. She laughed when he talked about his struggles and called him a small man with small dreams. When he couldn't give her what she wanted, Baraka started noticing the difference quickly. The house that once smelled of warm food and quiet prayers now echoed with silence and arguments. Leia spent his money faster than he earned it. She threw loud parties, bought clothes online, and left him with growing debts. The peace he once took for granted was gone. Completely. One evening, he came home and found her bags packed. She had met someone else, someone richer, someone who promised her more. She walked out without a tear, without a backward glance. Now, Baraka sat alone in the same house where Zaina once knelt to pray for him. The same kitchen where she cooked with love. The same bedroom where she cried quietly while he ignored her pain. There were no warm meals now. No soft hands to hold him. Just unpaid bills, empty silence, and the cold reminder that he had traded a queen for chaos. He scrolled through his phone looking at pictures of Zaina, her smile, her grace, the way she once looked at him with love. And for the first time the weight of his choices sank deep. Karma hadn't shouted when it came. It whispered. And it whispered, "You lost gold while chasing glitter." Baraka had traveled to Lusana City for a business deal. Something small he was hoping would bring in some extra cash after months of financial struggles. He was tired, stressed, and distracted as the taxi weaved through the busy streets. But then, as the car turned a corner near the city center, something made his heart stop. There she was, Zaina, her face larger than life, glowing on a giant billboard above the road. She was dressed in a bold, colorful outfit, rich green and gold patterns, standing tall and proud. Her head wrap was perfectly tied, her posture strong, and her smile. It wasn't the soft, quiet smile he remembered. This smile was powerful, confident, free. The billboard read, Zaina Afolabi, keynote speaker, African Women's Fashion Expo, founder of Nyaru Threads. Baraka sat back in the seat, stunned. The woman he once handed divorce papers to like she was nothing, was now someone the whole world wanted to hear from. Someone people looked up to. A woman he no longer recognized. She looked like royalty, like someone who had been through fire and come out shining. The taxi driver, unaware of Baraka's connection to her, smiled and said, "She's amazing, isn't she? Her story is everywhere now. Left a bad marriage, started her own brand. She's giving women hope." Baraka nodded slowly, but his throat tightened. He couldn't find words. He remembered how he had once told her, "You're not what I want anymore." And now here she was on a billboard, on a stage, on people's lips. She had become everything he didn't see in her, and more. That night Baraka couldn't sleep. The image of Zaina's strong smile haunted him. She was no longer the woman who begged for his love. She was the woman who rose without it. And as the lights of Lusana City twinkled outside his hotel window, Baraka realized he had lost something he could never get back. He hadn't just signed divorce papers that day. He had signed away a future with a woman who was born to shine. Baraka didn't plan to go to the African Women's Fashion Expo. Something in him just pulled him there, maybe curiosity, maybe regret, maybe both. He walked through the grand hall, surrounded by bright lights, elegant music, and powerful women dressed in rich African prints. He felt small, out of place, but he kept walking until he saw her. Zaina. She stood on stage, laughing gently as she greeted guests and shared her story with a grace that lit up the room. Her head was held high, her eyes calm, her steps full of quiet power. She wasn't hiding anymore. She wasn't shrinking to make anyone comfortable. She was shining. And Baraka couldn't look away. After the session he waited. His palms were sweaty, his heart beating faster than it had in years. When she finally stepped down from the stage and walked into the lobby, he gathered the courage to approach her. "Zaina," he said, his voice low, almost shaky. She turned and saw him. Her face didn't change. No anger. No sadness. Just a polite smile. "Baraka," she replied softly. "You look well." Her words were kind, but her tone held distance. Not cold, but strong. She wasn't that quiet woman waiting for his approval anymore. She was no longer the wife who cried behind closed doors. She was someone else now, someone free. Baraka opened his mouth to speak, but nothing came out. What could he say? That he missed her? That he was sorry? That he didn't know what he had until he saw her face on a billboard? She stood there waiting, still graceful, still calm. When he said nothing, she gave a small nod, then excused herself and walked away. Head high, shoulders firm, heart untouched. As Baraka stood there in the crowd of success and strength, he realized something deeply painful. He had broken her once, but she had built herself back without him, and into someone even he couldn't reach anymore. He came to reconnect. What he found was a woman too far above the pain he once caused. One quiet afternoon in Nyaru, as the ocean breeze whispered through the palm trees and the sound of sewing machines filled the air, Zaina looked up from her work and saw a figure standing at the gate. She squinted under the sunlight. Her heart didn't skip. It didn't race. It stayed still, steady. She knew that face. Baraka. He stood there, holding a bouquet of flowers, bright, fresh, awkward in his hands. He looked older, heavier with regret, his eyes softer than she remembered. Slowly she walked toward him, wiping her hands on her wrapper, her expression calm and unreadable. Zaina, he said, his voice low, almost unsure. She nodded, saying nothing, letting him speak. I was wrong, he began, his voice shaking. I didn't see you. I didn't understand your worth. And by the time I did, you were already gone. Already becoming everything I never believed you could be. I'm sorry. Truly. Zaina stood silently for a moment, the sound of distant waves behind her, the smell of herbs and fabric in the air. She looked at the flowers, then back at him. She smiled, not bitterly, not sadly. Just gently. A smile of peace. Thank you, she said softly. Not for the apology, but for setting me free. Baraka blinked, caught off guard. Without another word, Zaina turned and walked back into her workshop, where laughter and voices of women filled the space, where life was being stitched together stronger than ever, where her true home now lived. He stood at the gate, holding flowers she didn't take, watching the woman he had once called his wife walk away, not in pain, not in anger, but in power. That was the moment he truly understood. His apology had come from a place of guilt. Hers had come from a place of healing. She didn't need anything from him anymore. Not love, not closure, not even forgiveness. She had already given herself everything he couldn't, and now she was too far ahead for him to catch. The day of the African Women's Summit arrived, and Zaina stood backstage, adjusting her green and gold head wrap in front of a mirror. Her dress shimmered under the lights, woven from traditional fabric, stitched by her own hands, carrying the colors of healing, strength, and rebirth. She looked at herself for a moment, taking it all in. Not just the outfit, but the woman wearing it. This was the same woman who once cried silently on her birthday, and now she was about to stand in front of thousands. When her name was called, the applause began before she even stepped out. As she walked onto the stage, the sound grew louder, waves of cheers and claps from women of every age, every background. Some had followed her story online, some had worn her fabrics, some had simply heard of the woman from Nyaru who turned pain into purpose. Zaina stood tall, the lights warm on her skin, her heart steady. She took the microphone and looked out at the sea of faces. Not long ago, she was sitting on the floor of a dusty shed, stitching in silence. Now she was speaking on one of the biggest stages for women in Africa. She didn't talk like a professional speaker. She spoke like a sister, like a woman who had been through fire and made it out alive. She talked about heartbreak, about shame, about walking away with nothing but faith. She talked about the power of women coming together, sewing together, healing together. And she told them the truth. She didn't just survive. She soared. By the time she finished, the room was on its feet. Women clapped through tears, cheering not just for her, but for every woman who had ever been told she wasn't enough. Zaina didn't need a crown on her head. She was already crowned by her own strength, her own journey, and the love she gave to herself when no one else did. And as she stepped off the stage, she didn't walk like someone who had been broken. She walked like a queen. Baraka sat at the very back of the summit hall, his hands trembling as he clapped slowly, trying to hide the tears that were already running down his face. He had come without telling anyone, just sat quietly among the crowd, hoping to see her again, Zaina. He never expected what he saw. From where he sat, she looked like royalty, draped in green and gold, standing on stage with confidence, her voice echoing across the hall, reaching hearts, including his. She didn't just look beautiful. She looked powerful, free, alive. As she spoke, Baraka felt every word hit him like a wave. The stories she shared, the women she lifted, the lives she helped rebuild. He remembered the woman who used to sit quietly at their dining table, waiting for him to look at her. The woman he told was not enough. The woman he once silenced with cold words and ignored with proud eyes. And now she was on the biggest stage he had ever seen, speaking to thousands, changing lives. And he was just a man in the shadows, clapping through regret. He remembered the day he handed her divorce papers like a gift. The cruel words. The way she didn't cry in front of him, but broke silently behind closed doors. He thought he had won. Thought he was free. But now he saw it clearly. He hadn't left behind a broken woman. He had walked away from a queen in disguise. A woman with vision. With purpose. With a light so bright, he had been too blind to see it. As the crowd rose to their feet in applause, Baraka stayed seated, tears falling freely now. Not out of anger. Not out of jealousy. But out of deep, aching regret. He didn't lose her because she wasn't enough. He lost her because he didn't recognize her worth until the world did. And now the woman he once broke stood higher than he could ever reach. Not because he lifted her up, but because she rose without him. One quiet evening after the summit, Zaina sat alone in her workshop, the soft sound of waves in the distance and the scent of herbs in the air. She opened her old journal, the same one she had carried from Kasimba to Nyaru. It was filled with her private thoughts, her dreams, her pain, and her healing. She turned to a blank page, picked up her pen, and wrote from the deepest part of her heart. He gave me divorce papers on my birthday, but he also gave me the freedom to love myself again. She paused, reading the line over and over. It was simple, but it held her whole journey. The heartbreak, the quiet courage, the rising. Something told her to share it, so she posted it online with no fancy caption, just honesty. Within hours it spread like wildfire. Women across Africa began reposting it, adding their own stories. Some wrote, "This is my story too." Others said, "Thank you for saying what I couldn't put into words." The line was printed on t-shirts, quoted in speeches, even written on walls in schools and women's centers. It wasn't just a sentence. It was a mirror. It was hope. Zaina didn't expect it to go viral. She wasn't trying to be famous. She was just telling the truth. And that truth touched hearts in a way no billboard ever could. That one journal line reminded thousands of women that freedom doesn't always come wrapped in roses. Sometimes it comes disguised as heartbreak.